We're delighted you're joining us today to talk about the new reality of rollover advice. And just a few housekeeping matters before we get into it. We are recording today's conversation and plan to share the audio along with the slides. You'll get a prompt about that once the session ends. You can generate your interest via a few short clicks. This webinar also qualifies for one IACCP CE credit. So for those looking to confirm that, there's a few instructions on the screen that you can use, as well as uh, please remember that you can, and we actually advocate for you to jump in with any questions throughout today's session. This is a very timely conversation given the chain of events and the ups and downs and all these changes on the regulatory front. So your questions are most welcome. Use the prompt screen as you see on the chat box to generate any questions throughout today's conversation, and we'll either address them live or at the final 10-15 minute mark of the today's session. Right, let's move to introducing our esteemed panelists, starting with Mr. William Nelson.
Hi, and thanks, Parm, and thanks everybody for joining today. I'm William Nelson. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Associate General Counsel at the Investment Advisor Association. Have about 500 members, all fiduciary investment advisor firms, collectively about 57 trillion assets under management. And I lead both our legislative efforts, but also some of our regulatory efforts specifically related to the Department of Labor and ERISA.
Thanks.
All right, I'll go next and introduce myself. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm Ed Wegner, and I am a managing principal at CRC Oyster Consulting. I also head up the practice's governance, risk, and compliance practice. I've been with Oyster since July of 2020. And before that, I was a senior vice president and Midwest regional director for FINRA. And I spent most of my career as a regulator with FINRA, starting back in 1998 and there through 2020. So have a lot of experience working on these types of issues from both the regulatory side and on the industry side. So really looking forward to today's discussion.
I'm Fred Reich. I'm next on the screen, so it's my turn. I'm an ERISA attorney that specializes in fiduciary and related issues. What I mean by related is anytime you talk about fiduciary, you necessarily talk about conflicts of interest and prohibited transactions. You talk about disclosures, you talk about processes, policies, and procedures. So that whole area. I'm associated as of counsel with the Forensic Benefits Law Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm also doing consulting for different tax-exempt organizations who want to make proposals for improving the retirement system.
Nice. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for hosting this webcast, Parm, and bringing together the folks who inside DC are known pretty much as the fiduciary nerds. I truly appreciate that. I'm the columnist and Washington editor for Financial Advisor magazine, and I've covered the advisory and wealth management industry from a Washington, D.C. lens for more than 2 decades. I was formerly a columnist for Kiplinger's Personal Finance magazine and covered the real estate industry for the Washington Post. Even though I'm the only journalist on the panel, I really come at the issue of fiduciary regulation not so differently from my esteemed co-panelists. I try to ferret out trends and issues in compliance and enforcement that is going to be the next big story. And I never get more clicks and reads than I do about the so-called death of the fiduciary rule. But we all know, and I guess you're tuning in today, and Parm held this webcast because there are a lot of tripwires to navigating the dual framework that still remains. And, I can almost write the next enforcement, arbitration, or lawsuit articles in my head for firms whose practices do not comply. And that's never a good thing for executives or broker-dealers or RIAs who could save themselves all of that cost and especially the reputational damage. So thank you again, Parm, for having this webcast, and I'm looking forward to hearing my esteemed co-panelists explain the potential traps and pitfalls in the regs that remain. Handing it back to you.
Thanks, Tracy. I'll go ahead. My name is,
Oh, I'm sorry, Dave.
yeah, no, that's fine. My name is David Reeves. I'm the CEO of InvestorCom. We've had the great fortune of working with a lot of the major wealth platforms around rollovers and PT 2002 and associated Reg BI regulations. We've also been very fortunate to build a following of about 50,000 advisors on our platform. So, we're talking to advisors and firms every day. And, I generally think that regulations in North America broadly are very principle based and sometimes a bit difficult to interpret and, bring down to a practical strategy. So I just wanted to thank the panelists for joining us today to help us do that to this great audience. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. And my name is Param, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. As always, I'll keep reminding you to pop any questions you have on our chat box. But if you haven't come across InvestorCom, we're a leading software provider across North America, and our award-winning platform is really known for its intuitive solutions that help leverage compliance to build growth for your practice. So, with that in mind, I want to say a few quick initial comments because we had over 380 people sign up for today's webinar, and a lot of it came from our clients asking us questions around the ambiguity that's out there. And I think Tracy and Fred and everyone's touching on this. And Will, I've seen your comments publicly. I found this question that came in really, really a great symbol of the purpose of today's conversation. And one of our audience members sent this question to us pre-webinar, and it started with, I've tried to pick the brains of many wealth compliance leaders across the industry about how to comply with rollover compliance, with the rollover requirements, specifically PTE 2020-02. The answers are all over the place. So that was a recent addition to the conversation, but I think this is truly, it symbolizes the purpose of today's conversation and why we're here. There's been vacatures of the retirement security rule, and for whatever it's worth, what we're going to try to cover in today's conversation is aligning what those requirements are. Lots has happened over the years, and the ambiguity remains. And our goal today is our primary goal is to bring clarity to the conversation. Next, we'll talk about best practices, considering all the applicable standards that everyone's touching on. And then finally, we'll look at how leading firms and wealth advisors are shaping their rollover strategies to build trust, resilience, and long-term value for their clients. Last but not least, there's a Q&A session. Please engage our panelists with your questions throughout today's dialogue. Okay, enough caveats, enough preambles. Let's jump right in. We're going to start with a poll question, given everything that's going on. And Ankit, if I can ask you to bring that prompt onto the screen. How would you describe your firm's current approach to rollover recommendations? Is it fairly manual? Is it tech-enabled? Do you have purpose-built technology? Let's give this a few more seconds, and the numbers are going up quite aggressively. So when we get to 65% participation, I'll put the poll results.
Well, while we're waiting, Param, I know that you've asked this question in previous panels, and it'll be interesting to see how this has changed over time.
Exactly. Okay. 40 seconds. Let me end the poll and share the results. It's interesting. If folks can see the results, mostly manual, 30%, sort of an even split mix of manual and tech, and then the minority have adopted purpose built solutions on this front. So we'll get into that a little bit throughout today's session, and thank you all for participating. We'll have a few more poll questions for you throughout. Okay, take that module out of the way. Fred, maybe we can start with you. You've been at the center of the fiduciary rulemakings for decades, and I can confidently say that. Now that the retirement security rule has formally vacated and the DOL has restored the 1975 five-part test, can you just help our audience understand what does this mean for them? What does the future landscape look for the rollover recommendations?
Yeah, sure. Just foundationally, a couple things. One, anytime you talk about rollovers or really any fiduciary recommendations of consequence, you're talking about the standard of care, right? It can be imposed by the SEC, by FINRA, by ERISA, but there is a standard of care and how to satisfy that standard of care. Then there's also a conflict of interest. For example, with a rollover recommendation, you're recommending that money be taken out of a plan, typically, an advisor would, and that it be put into an IRA with the advisor, where the advisor and the advisory firm, or the broker dealer and the representative, would earn a fee or a commission. That fee or commission is the conflict of interest. In other words, it encourages the advisor, who may or may not succumb to the encouragement, encourages the advisor to recommend a rollover because you make more money that way. So that's the starting point, is to realize there's both a fiduciary rule and a conflict of interest rule in every regulatory scheme that we're going to talk about today. Then something kind of interesting that people really haven't paid much attention to is when the fiduciary regulation was vacated. And by the way, folks, what vacated means is that the court's saying it was never right to begin with, therefore it never existed. It's wiped out like it never ever happened. So anything that it repealed, it didn't really repeal because it never happened. In the preamble to the Biden era fiduciary information that was vacated was a provision that said, we're not going to follow what was called the Deseret opinion anymore. The Deseret advisory opinion said that if someone is already a fiduciary to a plan, then they will be a fiduciary for any rollover recommendations. So think about an advisor who's already a fiduciary helping with the plan lineup. They're a fiduciary still, even after the Biden era rule is vacated, that person is still a fiduciary for any rollover recommendations. There is increasing popularity today for advisor managed accounts. If you're managing a participant account with discretion, anytime you have discretion, you're automatically a fiduciary, period, under ERISA. So if you're managing a participant account and being compensated for it, directly or indirectly, then you're also a fiduciary for that account, which means you're a fiduciary for any rollover recommendation you make to that participant. So I think, what that tells us is that the fiduciary rule, the standards that the DOL has laid out for the standard of care and conflicts of interest, which in ERISA are called prohibited transactions, still apply. So you still have a duty of care, and you still have to follow the provisions, and the duty of care is a fiduciary rule, a prudent process, and then you have to follow the provisions in prohibited transaction exemption 2020-02, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But all that stuff still applies. So don't be thinking that now that these rules have been vacated, that it doesn't apply in that scenario. There are other, I'm not going to steal William's thunder, but the SEC for investment advisors has a fiduciary standard of its own, and its own, by the way, which in this area is remarkably similar to the DOL rule for the standard of care, somewhat different for conflicts of interest. But William, I promise not to step on your toes anymore.
You can take it all day, Fred. I am, you're the guy, so no worries.
Yeah. And just to give you an example, one last example, and then I'll stop my monologue. In some cases, I've actually taken the work, working with broker dealers, working with investment advisory firms, taken the work that I did to help them comply with prohibited transaction exemption 2020-02, including the disclosures and documentation, and have modified that even for their advisors who aren't fiduciaries and who aren't subject to PTE 2020-02, because it's got some good best interest processes in it that helps with compliance more generally. And my last thing, now that I think about it, is with the rule is vacated for those completely gone for someone who's not otherwise an advisor to the plan. If you're not a fiduciary to the plan, then you're going to be subject to these other regulations. But under the 5-part test that was reinstated, the old 1975 rule, you have to provide recommendations on a regular basis to be a non-discretionary fiduciary advisor. And that means that if you make a one-time recommendation to a participant to roll over to you, you're not a fiduciary, you're not an ERISA fiduciary. Under Williams' watch, you may be an investment advisor, SEC fiduciary with its own set of rules, but you're no longer an ERISA fiduciary unless you occupy an ERISA fiduciary status to the plan or a participant in the plan. So there.
Hey, Fred, I got a question that comes up often with regards to that. So if you're a broker-dealer or an investment advisor and you're not a fiduciary to the plan and you don't meet the 5-part test, so you wouldn't fall under this particular requirement. One of the requirements had been doing a retrospective review. And so in those cases, would the requirement to do the retrospective review then be gone if you don't otherwise fall under this rule requirement or the exemption requirement?
Uh, and a good lawyer answer, yes and no. The DOL requirement for a retrospective review, yes, is gone. The DOL requirement that you have policies and procedures about rollovers is gone. But the SEC, and again, I'm stepping on Williams' toes, the SEC will require policies and procedures. The SEC has its own annual retrospective review for compliance with the policies and procedures. So I don't know how much relief you really get there, but my sense is it's certainly not complete relief.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. Hugh William, share your views.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Fred, as always, is spot on. There are so many similarities. And, I think this is sometimes what gets a little bit lost is that if you're already an investment advisor, you already have your own fiduciary duty as far as the SEC is concerned. Duty of care, like Fred talked about, is it in the best interest of the client? Is it tailored to their needs, their goals, objectives? But also that duty of loyalty. But I think that's really where it gets different, right? Because the SEC has historically been a disclosure-based regime, right? You disclose it to the client, you obtain that informed consent, you can move forward. On the other hand, generally ERISA will just say, well, that's prohibited unless there's some type of exemption that you can rely on. But also with respect to the compliance reviews, as a former chief compliance officer, I can tell you the SEC is very focused on rollovers. Are you looking at the plan? What type of fees are they charging? What services is your client getting? When you're rolling it over, what are you rolling over to? If it's to an IRA, do you have any financial relationships with that company? Is it in the client's best interest? Could it be in the client's best interest to stay in the plan, obviously, unless they're being kicked out for whatever reason. But, I think that, as an SEC fiduciary advisor, it's still important to know that just because, you may not be subject to the DOL fiduciary or have to rely on the PT 2002, there's still so many similar obligations related to documentation, related to fees, related to conflicts. Generally, it just comes up in the context of disclosure rather than any type of prohibited transaction.
William, can I ask a question, sort of a follow-up on that? It seems, and I'm no securities lawyer, so I don't want to.
I play one on webinars, so go ahead.
I got one on TV. What the heck? But it seems to me recently, at least in the last 5 or 10 years, I've seen more and more SEC language about mitigating conflicts of interest.
Yeah.
And in the rollover area, it has always struck me, since a rollover is an all or nothing deal. Either the money stays in the plan, you don't make any money on it, or it rolls to an IRA and you do make money on it. So there's like no in between, no way to mitigate other than, and this is my thinking now, and I'm sort of bouncing it off you, but no way to
Yeah.
mitigate other than having a really good process for doing the things that you just described. It's like you got to have a great process because you can't
Yep.
mitigate it any other way.
Yeah, no, and I think that's exactly right, Fred. So again, the prudent process, just like you'd have under the Department of Labor fiduciary, it would be much similar, under the SEC rules as well. Because you're absolutely right. When you're just, doing the rollover all or nothing, you're going to be getting the compensation you didn't necessarily get before. But also, historically it has been that disclosure-based regime, but as you said in the past few years, especially, and I know Ed's going to talk about regulation best interest, but there has been this push to, either manage or mitigate, whatever the type of language you want to use, those types of conflicts. So it's not just disclosure. Disclosure is not enough anymore, I think would be kind of the point I'd want to make. You still need to say, hey, is this in the best interest? If there's conflicts, am I managing or mitigating those conflicts? Not just disclosure.
Thanks.
You guys are making it really easy for me, Mr. Wagner.
No, and thanks for that tee up. And you're making it easy for Parham, but a little difficult on me because I think it's a lot of the same thing. The question that we often get is whether there's going to be some sort of shift in regulatory requirements or exam approaches, and it's a great question. We get it from our clients all the time. As we've been talking about it's complicated, but it's also not complicated. And what I mean by that is I think it shifts the question from the who, meaning who's responsible in writing the rules and requirements, to the what. And the what is, as we've been talking about, is very similar across regulators. And my expectation is that whether it's FINRA or the SEC, if you're a broker-dealer, an investment advisor, they're going to continue to review rollovers as they would otherwise under the rules. I think it was mentioned before that the SEC put out a staff bulletin on account recommendations, where part of that was in large part to align the expectations between what Reg BI requires and what the fiduciary standard for investment advisors requires, understanding that there's differences, but to try to align those as best as they could. And they even referred to the PTE in there to try to align there as well under that. But irrespective of that, the SEC and FINRA are still looking at rollovers just under their own rules and requirements. And right now that's largely going to be under Reg BI and under the fiduciary requirements. And so I would really recommend, in this regard, that firms go back and take a look at that staff bulletin and account recommendations, because, you'll see that the SEC, you'll see where they try to align that, but you'll also see that they have some specific guidance in terms of what their expectations are. And I really expect that they're going to be reviewing rollovers under the context more broadly of account type recommendations, as well as the requirement to do a reasonably available alternatives review. And so I think that specifically what you can expect to see is they're going to want to see that, again, like everybody's been saying, that the rollover is in a client's best interest. Importantly, they're going to expect to see a comparison between the recommended rollover and other alternatives, including leaving those assets in the employer's plan to the extent that that is an option. The factors that they talk about in that staff bulletin, are similar to making any other type of recommendation or account type recommendation. They're going to expect that you assess, what are the differences between the costs and the fees between the different alternatives. What are the differing level of services between the alternatives? What investment options are available? What features are there in the existing plan? What features are there in the recommended rollover? What features are available in other alternatives that might be out there, as well as the impact on an investor's ability to be able to withdraw funds from the plan. So, those expectations, I think, are similar to what the DOL had expressed in the PTE related to rollovers. And it's what the SEC expects under the investment advisor's fiduciary requirement, but also for broker-dealers, for the SEC and FINRA under Reg BI. I think that one of the things that is really critical to be thinking about is when making those recommendations, making sure that the individual that's making the recommendation has access to the right information to be able to conduct that analysis. So that includes things like information about the employer's plan, or at least, some reasonable benchmarking information. And another important thing, and they refer to this in the staff bulletin, and it's a little bit confusing given what they said in Reg BI in the preamble. Um, with Reg BI, the SEC said that they, didn't necessarily expect that there'd be documentation maintained to support all recommendations. But in the staff bulletin, they seem to imply that there's some level of documentation. That notwithstanding, whether it is or isn't required, I always recommend that firms do make sure that they document the basis for these recommendations. Because if asked to explain why a recommendation was in a client's best interest, if you don't have that information and documentation, it's going to be very difficult to demonstrate, how that conclusion was drawn. So it makes it a lot easier if you do have documentation. Additionally, and one of the things that they said in the staff bulletin is it's difficult to demonstrate that you have a process and that you're following that process if you don't have some level of documentation. So it is a little bit confusing where in one sense they say you're not necessarily expected to have documentation, and otherwise they say, well, we think that you should in some cases. My recommendation would be to err on the side of maintaining documentation. So from, the exam perspective, that's kind of what I would expect.
I want to second what Ed is saying about that staff bulletin. I would encourage everybody to get the SEC staff bulletin on account recommendations and to review it. Just picking up what Ed just said, that's section 6 or paragraph 6 of the staff bulletin. And it says, in the staff's view, it may be difficult for a firm to assess periodically the adequacy and effectiveness of its policies and procedures, or to demonstrate compliance with its obligations to retail investors without documenting the basis. I mean, I'm more of an ERISA attorney than a securities lawyer. So I went and talked to some securities lawyers that I know. And I said, okay, yeah, that's all like SEC speak. What does that mean in the real world? And they tell me it means in the real world, you better be documenting it, because when you're examined, they're going to expect to find documentation supporting rollover recommendations. So I just want to say, what I think Ed just said is really important.
Yeah, no, and I'll second both Ed and Fred. I like that. So, being through several SEC exams as a CCO, absolutely. If you don't document it, didn't exist. And the SEC examiners will ask for it. And they'll be like, why did you make this recommendation? Because they're looking for that reasonable basis. Because if you just say, oh yeah, we made this recommendation because X, well, what was behind it? What was the analysis? What were the fees? What were the different investment options? Did you actually look at whether it would have been better than to stay in the plan rather than to roll it over? So absolutely, I think that documentation, even though maybe it's technically not required, I haven't seen a SEC examiner yet who doesn't ask for it.
That's the punchline. We've also seen SEC ask questions of our clients who have a process where they make rollover recommendations, and so that's effectively what's in play today. I see questions coming in, and it's really important we tackle them. To our lovely panelists, you've made it really, really easy for me. I don't even need to be part of this conversation today. But Tracy, I know you cover these developments. You made some really interesting remarks at the top around the level of interest around this topic. In your view, are you seeing the industry internalize the opportunity and requirements ahead?
I wish I could say yes, that is true. I think we were all sort of waiting and holding our breath, knowing that there was every likelihood that the federal, courts were going to vacate the overarching rule, but leave parts of it because they had indicated that. And so I don't, but I think there's huge opportunities here for those who want to take on fiduciary responsibility. Huge competitive opportunities, as I know InvestorCom has pointed out when you look at the $1.2 trillion rollover market. But there are some major differences, I think, between just Reg BI for those who are looking to do education only or one-time advice only, and the DOL PTE 2020-02. And I think just like pointing that out and trying to figure out how to not only hit the compliance mark, but also from a who are we perspective, it is important for the industry. It's sort of really, because of the escalating rollovers that we're going to already see, but we're going to see even more in the future. It's important for the industry to get their arms around that. So if you're following Reg BI, which is no easy task, you're not required to do written fiduciary acknowledgement, but you must state unambiguously that the firm and advisor are fiduciaries. I think that's a potential competitive advantage. For written disclosures of specific reasons to the client to do a rollover for Reg BI, you're not required. They must have a basis, but you don't have to provide it in writing to the investor. Whereas with for those who take on full fiduciary rollover responsibility, you must provide the client written reasons why the rollover is in their best interest. Again, on rollover analysis for Reg BI, you must consider cost risks and reasonable alternatives. And according to what my fellow panelists have said, the SEC is digging in more and, going to dig in and has started digging in more in terms of what those are. But you're not going to have that wiggle room with the DOL. You already don't have it because you must document specific factors, including fee comparisons and the alternatives like staying in the plan. Also, the conflict mitigation is different. For Reg BI, you require identification and mitigation of incentives only at the advisor level, but for the firms that take on full fiduciary rollover advice responsibility, it requires mitigation of conflicts for both the firm and advisor. So I think there's, some stark differences, and they're really even more than that if you go through it in terms of documentation retention, annual review. That's not required for those who use education only or one-time advice, but it is required. You must conduct an annual retrospective review certified by a senior executive if you're doing full-on fiduciary advice. And so the record-keeping responsibilities, and again, how you're doing what you do and be able to recreate that if an examiner comes in or clients, have issues down the road is just going to be very important, more important than ever, I think.
Thank you, Tracy. This is incredibly valuable. Dave, I wonder if you can share a few observations that you've come across our clients. How are they reacting? Are there any changes? What are you seeing on that front?
Do you mean our existing clients?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I would say broadly, there's no question that our engagement with our current customer base, all that momentum started with compliance, and in particular PT 2020-02 several years ago. So that was kind of the impetus for our engagement. But it's interesting. I'd say most of these partnerships have evolved beyond compliance to business enablement, a term one of our clients uses, and growth. And we all know, Tracy just mentioned it, that the rollover opportunity of $1 trillion or $1.2 trillion annually is one of, if not the largest organic growth opportunity facing wealth firms for the next 20 to 30 years. But accessing that really appealing opportunity is plagued with friction, and compliance could be part of that friction. I was actually speaking with someone recently who shared that their rollover took 9 months to complete. So, friction is a bit of an understatement. So, our focus is, we've solved this friction problem by evolving our tech and partnering with the very best retirement technology partners along the rollover spectrum from prospecting through transfer. And, I would say our wealth firm partners are pretty well positioned to capture a bigger slice of that $1 trillion pie, which is exciting for them, obviously, exciting for us. And I think it's good for the industry at large because advised retirement plans, there's real evidence that they're driving stronger returns. So that's kind of a bit of our view from 10,000 feet.
Thank you, Dave. I think This is a good pause for another quick poll question. I'm shocked at how quickly time's running by here. What's your biggest concern following the vacature of the retirement security rule? We should take bets on.
I noticed that you don't have an all of the above thing in there. I don't know if that was by design.
Uh, I'll consult you that next time on.
No, forced to choose. No, I think that's right. Otherwise, I think it would all be all of the above.
Yeah.
I was going to say, Ed, when one question gets 100% of the responses, doesn't lead to much conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's give this, okay, we're at 60% participation. Let's give this a few more seconds. I still see the number trickling upwards, and I'll post the results. Eeny, meeny, miny. Let's do this end poll, share the results. So, greater majority is saying unclear with regulatory standards actually apply to our rollover advice. So I hope the conversation today, by the way, we have a checklist that you can go through following today's session. You'll get a prompt on it. You can use that as a guide to uh, is it the SEC? Is it 2020-02? What part of 2022-02? And then how do I decide if I'm providing ongoing advice? So please click through that as well. Okay, I'll stop sharing this and let's move forward. So what I want to cover next is sort of taking this into practice. We've talked a lot about policy, regulatory expectations, but building a defensible rollover process is, I think, what everyone's come here to learn. And so, Fred, let's start with what you've counseled firms through multiple rounds of fiduciary rulemaking. What's the no regret investment that our audience, people in the wealth compliance world can make to effectively find a way forward amidst all these rule changes?
Sure. There's some consistency among all the rules, and they are even with Reg BI, which is called best interest rather than fiduciary. Uh, there is a heightened standard that's consistent across the board, and basically it involves, and I'm going to talk about the hardest part first, getting information about the plan, the plan's investments, services, and expenses. A little more than that, but a good way to think about it is those three categories. What are the plan's investments? What are the plan's services? What's the plan's cost? Then putting together what you think those comparable things would be in the IRA. What will the IRA investments be? Now, not just what are available, but what of the IRA investments would be valuable to this particular person? What are the costs and what are the services? The firm services and the individual advisor services, and what kind of value are they going to add? Then third, you do the investor profile, which people do anyway, but that's the third step. So you look at the plan investments, services, and expenses. You look at the IRA investment services and expenses. You look at the needs and circumstances of the participant, the investor, as reflected on the profile. And then you make a decision in the best interest. What's best for that person? It is an individualized decision. It's not like some generic, everybody's better off doing such and such. But if you can gather that and then document it, one, you've engaged in a process that cuts across all these different regulatory bodies as being compliant. Secondly, it's not just the truth that you did it, but you have the proof that you did it in case the regulators come in and look at you. So plan information, IRA information, investor information, and then an analytical process that says, hey, what's best for this person over the long haul? And I think that is an approach that will serve you well, no matter which regulatory regime we're talking about. But it's hard. Getting that plan data can be the hardest part of that. That's where I get feedback from my clients that's a big change for them. But it's necessary.
Absolutely. I mean, how can you give prudent advice without that plan information, or at least some, as Ed said, the benchmark or some indication, some reasonable indication that you're looking at the appropriate features, services, and investment costs within that plan. So completely agree there.
Yeah. That SEC guidance we talked about earlier specifically says you have to consider leaving the money in the plan. That applies to broker dealers and investment advisors. How can you possibly consider that without knowing what's in the plan? If it's a really good plan, with expense ratios of 10 and 20 basis points, that's, with really good investment, that's one thing. If it's a plan with expense ratios of 100, 125, 150 basis points, then you not only in terms of services, you could reduce the costs for the participants. So it's an individualized as to the plan, as to the IRA, and as to the person.
On this point, one of the questions that I see in the dialogue box, I think it's very timely. We keep getting asked about it as well, Fred, is you'll recall when 2020-02, at least the FAQ / preamble came out, there was a requirement around IRA to IRA and plan to plan and commission to fee-based as part of 2020-02. What happens with those branches of recommendations going forward?
Well, it depends. If you're a fiduciary to a plan, either because you're managing a participant account or you're helping construct the lineup for the plan sponsor, then you really need to certainly follow PTE 2020-02, and those frequently asked questions you're talking about were DOLs thinking about ways to comply with that or issues that you had to address. So I would say for that person, that stays in place. When it comes to like what Ed does with FINRA and the SEC, regulated clients, and what William does, it doesn't necessarily apply. I think you have to look at it and say, does it make sense? If it makes sense, every one of these sets of rules is gonna cover it. Every regulator.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Fred. Tracy, you've tracked this story across multiple administrations, from firms watching from the sideline. For firms watching from the sidelines, what's the risk of just waiting things out from your perspective?
I think that would be unwise. I don't know exactly what they would be waiting for, because I would think that if Republicans lose the White House, and they really only have it for 2+ years, we could get another fiduciary rule. I think that there are people in the Biden administration, former DOL folks, that would chomp at the bit to, take another bite of this apple. So I personally would try to get up to speed and not wait until a regulator ferrets out the fact that you might not be doing things. I think the biggest traps I see is people relying on the regular basis trap without really, assuming one-time advice is safe, when really there are a lot of ways that they can get tripped up with that. I think that the regulators will look at if fiduciary advice is intended to be part of an ongoing relationship, or if you've had relationships with the company, or with you have an affiliate or subsidiary that has assets from the same investor or plan. If you're servicing a plan, you do have ongoing advice relationships in other arenas, to try to carve out a one-time advice that way is going to be increasingly hard. And as far as regulators viewing rollovers they may start viewing rollovers as the first step in a regular basis, especially if you're transitioning clients into fee-only accounts. There's some suggestion that you're going to continue providing advice. And so that could trigger retroactive fiduciary status for your recommendation. So I would be wary of that.
That's really helpful, Tracy. Thank you. And maybe some comments on the supervisory / oversight perspective. What foundational practices do you think firms need to instill in their processes, given everything that's shifted?
Yeah, I think about, and it goes back a ways, but my time as an examiner, and since I was 1998 is when I started, and a lot's changed, but some things haven't. And so I kind of look at what I'd expect firms to have. Like, what would I look for if I was conducting an examination? The first place I would start is to make sure that you have effective policies, procedures, processes in place in order to both make sure that the recommendation itself is in the client's best interest, and you did all the considerations that the guidance talks about, but also that you have a process in place for monitoring on a regular basis across your program, so that you can make sure that if there's something that might be going awry, that you can identify it and address it. You don't want the first time you find these things out to be when an examiner comes in and finds them for you. So having a system that's set up to allow for that type of monitoring is really important. Making sure, we talked about this a lot, but making sure you have access to the right information as part of that process, and that information is getting to the people who are making those recommendations. That's a critical component of that process. And then making sure the process covers all the factors that we discussed earlier. Talked about it a lot before, but making sure that you have some means to document those recommendations is important. And one of the things that, or in terms of things that I've seen where firms have struggled, is having processes that are overly manual, and leaves too much discretion to the advisors in terms of that process. And what I mean by that is, um, it doesn't provide a lot of guidance in terms of what that analysis looks like, how to document the analysis, all of that kind of things. And it leads to inconsistency across your advisors. Sometimes firms have too prescriptive of a process where it's check the box and say which apply. That might be too prescriptive and not allow the advisor to provide some context around that. So where I see an effective practice is to have a process that's not overly manual, but that allows for some guided analysis, but also some free form to provide some context around it. Um, Another thing, and I said this before, is not having a process that allows for monitoring, and that kind of goes along with a manual process. If you have a manual process where people are filling out forms and sticking them in a file, or entering information into sort of an unscripted CRM or an unmonitored CRM, it's very difficult for compliance to be able to go and say, how are we doing? If you have a more tech-driven process, it typically allows for you to be able to periodically go and say, what are we seeing out there? Not having to rely on doing your branch inspections to go look and see what's going on. So I think having not relying so much on manual processes is a good practice. Um, and the other thing I'd say is a huge part of this is training. If you have great processes and policies and procedures in place, but they're not being implemented appropriately, your program's not effective. So it's important to really make sure that you're training your advisors on how to do the analysis, how to document that analysis. That's going to be critical, and then having a process to monitor, uh, just to make sure that it's going the way you intend it to.
Thank you, Ed. I mean, there was a question that popped in and you answered it around monitoring, so it makes good sense. Obviously, monitoring manually filled PDF forms is a lot more challenging than digital data points that you can look at and analyze every which way. So that's helpful. Will, super quickly, I know we want to get to our Q&A session, but curious what trends you're seeing across your member base around employing solutions on this front.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does definitely revolve around technology, automated workflows, making sure that advisors have flexibility, but at the same time having that structure in place where compliance can go through, do the proper auditing, do the proper reports. So that's mostly what I've been seeing right now is whether that is a CRM that has that capacity, whether that's a tool, I have seen a lot more firms moving towards that more automated workflow process, and again, which I think is a fantastic idea.
Thanks, Will. Um, Dave, quick question your way. As you look forward, and are there trends that are appearing across our clients that and is there data that we've observed over time?
Uh, for sure. I mean, our clients, which would be a subset of the market, of course, who are on the automation sort of side, which I think you showed represent less than a third of the attendees here. There's no question we see them stepping into this $1 trillion opportunity by leveraging simple tech to make this opportunity easy for advisors. I mean, one of the very large platforms in the US market, over 2,500 advisors, don't do any rollovers because the advisors feel like it's too difficult. So, kind of back to that friction issue. I'd say the other thing we see in some cases, there are firms that have always been focused on this convergence of retirement and wealth opportunity, but in other cases, there are firms that have decided to shift from education to recommendations to position themselves for this growth. So that's a big shift. I know the education only group has not been huge in numbers, but it's significant in advisors, and so we're starting to see that move. I think largely because of the opportunity. But I'd say most importantly, we see some pretty satisfied advisors who find our tech simple. I think tech broadly is designed to be simple and intuitive. And as we all know, without advisor sat, you don't get adoption, and you're not going to really capture this opportunity. So it's not just about sort of applying a tool to the problem. It's ensuring that it's simple for advisors. They can do things in a compliant manner, feel confident. And that's kind of what we're seeing, that, a lot of firms are really leaning into this opportunity.
Thanks, Dave. That's really helpful. Folks, we're jumping into the Q&A session. Hopefully, it gives us enough time. I've seen plenty of conversations or questions come up. Feel free to jump in with your questions through the chat box. And before we do that, quick and final poll question. If I can ask for your help on Kit, what's the biggest barrier preventing your firm from scaling your rollover advice? Is it regulatory uncertainty? Oh, no, not this question. If you could just move to the next question. Here we go, Ed. We got a combination of all the above here. So sure enough, we'll jump into that. And here's the question. If I could ask everyone to just participate on this one, what's the biggest barrier preventing your firm from scaling on rollover advice? Give that a few more seconds.
While this is going, one of the things that I was struck by as we talked about sort of the market and the increasing number of people approaching retirement is, we're talking about this in the terms of rollovers, but when you're talking about people who are approaching retirement, you're also talking about seniors. And both regulators, FINRA and the SEC, have been very focused on recommendations to seniors. So I think they will be looking at all of this through that lens too, if the individual that you're making a recommendation to would be considered a senior. So something to keep in mind.
That's a really good point, Ed. I did see that um, I did see that as I was examining the exam priorities. Let me share the results. Regulatory uncertainty is the biggest barrier to preventing firms from scaling rollover advice. I hope this webinar has helped. And the second one is advisor training and adoption. So that's a good pointer for us. We'll try to do what we can. And so far, the feedback on our adoption and training has been fantastic. So happy to engage there as well. Okay, stop sharing. Let's jump into our lightning round. I saw plenty of questions come up throughout today's conversation. We had many questions that came in actually beforehand. I talked about one of them off the top around uh, the the picking the brains of wealth compliance professionals. Um, Here, let me just lay this one out. It's what feedback are you getting from regulators or those that have been examined on 2020-02 under this administration? Do you see any tweaks to the rule under current or future administrations? Maybe Will or Ed, have you come across any
It's
exam?
it's interesting because the examinations for the PTE, DOL doesn't have an examination team to do that. And so any of the examinations that we've seen have all been done either by FINRA or by the SEC. And again, they're doing it through the guise of Reg BI and the fiduciary requirements. So, but again, I think they've tried to leave as little light between those requirements. And so I think given that the SEC has the same requirements under the fiduciary requirement and Reg BI, and those haven't changed, I haven't really seen a big change in the expectations. Now, under different administrations, I think you have different approaches to conducting exams and enforcement type initiatives. So I think that changes from time to time. But in terms of the expectations, I think they're the same now, and I would anticipate that they'll be the same going forward.
Yeah, no, and I think you're spot on. The exams we've seen, have focused on, what advice you're providing, are you substantiating that advice? What did you disclose to the client? But also, I think it was a great point too that, when you are reaching retirement age, obviously, you would be likely a senior investor, an elder investor, and there are going to be a lot more eyes on that rather than, if you're in your 20s and you have a lot higher risk profile. So,
Yeah, definitely that sort of the mosaic of the investor's profile has to definitely be considered in that equation. I see a lot of similar questions around IRA to IRA, a lot of questions around sort of how can one qualify for um, the five-part test as well as whether they're deemed a fiduciary or not. So I hope today's conversation has clarified that. I know we've got 2 minutes left. I won't be able to cover all these questions, but maybe I can commit to getting back to folks with some responses. Um, in that, like, can I ask if anybody on the panel has any final comments, given the ambiguity, given the lack of clarity, and it is technically complex. Um, Panelists, any final parting remarks?
I had one remark, and I would be very interested to hear from Ed and William and Dave if they fear this because we see a trend, I think, from the SEC and to some extent FINRA. And I'm not so sure about the DOL, but it could come into play that for the IRA to IRA rollovers, recommending a transfer between two IRAs triggers PTE 2020-02 requirements if there's a conflict like higher fees. So, you may think you're skirting this, but you're really not going to be able to. And I'm just wondered, we hear on the conference circuit from the SEC folks that just because a fee is higher, it's not going to necessarily trigger, Reg BI issues or potentially these fiduciary issues. But I'm just wondering from William, Ed, and Dave's perspective if that's true and how that should be disclosed and handled, especially with a sort of changing focus in the marketplace to offer more fee only advice.
yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. And, I think looking at cost alone isn't enough. You're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of our members are always looking for that value add, whether it's services, whether it's investment options. We actually just saw the recent Department of Labor investment alternatives rule that came out, and they basically said the same thing, right? ERISA doesn't require specific products. It doesn't require lowest cost option. It really wants you to show that how you're adding value. Now, of course, you still have to say, oh yeah, we are offering these services. We are offering these, different alternative investments. But you're absolutely right that it goes well beyond cost and fees.
Yeah, just to follow on that, it's definitely going to raise the question if it's a higher cost alternative, and so you have to be able to justify it and make sure that justification isn't just boilerplate because we've seen that where it's every time it's like it's always going to be one standard sentence that says greater options and my ability to manage the program or something, similar to that. So really make sure if it is a higher cost recommendation that you have really good documentation so you can tell that story. That's definitely somewhere I would absolutely have good documentation.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Will. Fred and Dave, always a pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for investing an hour of your time with us this afternoon.